Hey everybody, on this week's episode I wanted to do a little bit of a terrain experiment. I picked up one of these 3-inch plasma balls off of Amazon for about $15, and I'll make sure I have the link in the description down below. But I felt like I could do something pretty cool with it. So what I'm going to do is use this as a centerpiece for one of my D&D terrain encounters. So first thing we're going to do is we are going to put it in the center and trace it out and make sure that it is as center as possible. And then we are just going to cut out that circle using a regular utility blade. I'm sure there's other better, faster, cleaner ways to do this, but for the way that I am using this, it doesn't really need to be clean. It just needs to fit the base of the plasma ball in the center of my foam piece. So on the bottom side of it, you want it to fit just well enough so that you can still access the little button, the dip switch to flip it. So you can take your utility knife again and then just cut out a section and trim it down so that from underneath it you can still turn it on, turn it off, and of course swap out the batteries as needed. Next here, I'm going to use some plates as stencils and a hot wire knife to just trace and etch in 2 larger circles around the main circle where the plasma ball is going to go. Of course, you can take any old cardboard boxes and create your own stencils out of cardboard, but this is what I had on hand. Everybody should have some dishes in their household, and they work pretty well for stencils because the ceramic won't burn as you're going around the edges, so they just work out pretty well. Now that I've got 2 circles around the edges, I'm just going to start making random markings and things that might look like runes to me. I feel like maybe I need to do a little bit more homework on what is a good D&D or fantasy rune, but you know, it's just an experiment, so I just started etching along as I went and just making random symbols along the edges, which is going to create the rune when everything is finished. And now I'm going to use the old tried and true, take some tinfoil, crumple it all up, and roll it all over the piece for texturing. This is a really effective method, and I think a lot of people use this these days. You just want to make sure you're not dragging the tinfoil over the piece or it will start tearing at your foam. You just want to roll it and start smashing it into it, and it's going to give you a really nice stone texture. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare to place the plasma ball into place, and I'm going to use some DOS air putty to mold it in and cover up the hole, and this is really going to seal it into place. You can, of course, go and put some hot glue around the edges of the plasma ball at the base if you would like to. I actually selected not to do that. The air putty dried firm and hard enough where it is not going to move. So you're just going to go all the way around. Get your fingers wet where you need to help smooth it out to make sure there's a nice clean, smooth transition from the putty into the foam. Try not to get your putty too high to where it touches the glass ball. It could affect the electrical effect once it's on with something making contact with it, so just make it go up to the rim. So next step here, we're going to use some Mod Podge. The same old method that I usually use, black paint and Mod Podge, and sometimes a little bit of water to thin it out where I need to. And you're going to use this to firm up your piece, and of course it acts as a base layer primer. You can take the little glass ball off of the plasma ball without damaging it. It really just kind of twists and pops right off, so I don't get any black Mod Podge on it. I'm going to go around the entire piece. I'm not going to do the underside, but I will do the edges around the 4 edges, and just do this as many times as you need to. You may only need 2 coats. At a minimum, I think you're going to need at least 2 coats. You have to be very careful not to go too heavy or your etching will be completely filled and you'll undo all the work that you did earlier with your hot knife. I should also mention that I used a foam brush for this instead of a cheap painter's brush. Last time I used a cheap painter's brush, I ended up getting all the bristles and the hairs caught in the Mod Podge, and the foam brush just absorbs it a little bit better and rolls it on smoother, and I've had better luck. For the pillars, we're going to use 1 inch by 1 inch cuts that have already been made on my Proxen, but they're 1 inch by 1 inch, and then we are going to cut smaller, uniform chunks out and use a pen to etch in the blocks in the same pattern you see me doing here. I did this in another video earlier, which I'll have a link to, but it's very easy to do. You just make the same exact etches, stack them all together, and boom, you have a nice beautiful pillar like that. So to prep all of this now for priming after the Mod Podge has dried, I'm going to take a paper towel after I've taken the glass dome off, stack it in here so none of the paint gets on the inside of the plasma ball, and I'm going to prime it in my typical gray that I use. And you'll notice I always tend to do it a little bit splotchy, and that's intentional to give it a little bit more depth in the piece. Using 2 different colors here, I'm using a khaki and an antique white that I picked up from the hobby shop. It's about, I don't know, 60 to 99 cents per bottle. You don't need anything fancy for this. You're just going to do a half and half mix between the khaki and the off-white, so you get a nice, even more off-white brownish color. And then you are going to dry brush, wipe off any excess, and then just go crazy all over your piece, picking out all those nice details that you made earlier from the foam ball, and it's just going to really start making everything pop. We'll also make sure that we're going to repeat this on the columns as well, using the same method, 50-50 of khaki and antique white, and you're just going to aggressively dry brush it. There's really no wrong way to do it. Just make sure that you're brushing off most of the paint onto a paper towel so that you're not just painting your pieces. You want it to just basically lightly pick out all of the nice details and the lines all around the pieces. Once your dry brushing is done, we're going to start using some texturing around the actual plasma ball itself. I wanted to do a really interesting effect where it looked like there has been growth, or maybe this thing has popped out of the ground, something that tells a unique story and intrigues your players. So what I'm using is Vallejo thick mud, and I'm just going around the base and patting it in, and I'm going to start tamping it down so it just kind of merges into the stone around the base. So while this firms up, the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to start airbrushing in my runes. I'm using just 2 colors here. I'm using a light blue and a very bright white. I'm going to start etching around, following the lines that I made earlier with my hot wire knife, and I am just going to use the blue. You can kind of be relatively aggressive. I mean, it's pretty easy. Just follow the lines and make sure that the blue is as consistent in color and opacity as you go all around each of the runes. So once your blue is done, you're going to transition over to white. Again, this doesn't have to be perfect. What the white is going to do is help you sell your glow effect. And you want this to be more central to the line, so the blue ends up being on the outside and the white ends up being in the center. This is going to help sell the fact that it is a glowing rune on the ground. The more white you put in the center and the more you kind of whisk and fade it out around the edges, the more of a glow effect it's going to have. Now I'm putting on a homemade black wash to mix this into my Vallejo thick mud, just to give it a little extra depth and some color variance as we kind of melt everything together. Once we get to the green stage, it's going to definitely give it a little bit more depth. I will say something that really bothered me after I airbrushed this. Again, this was an experiment. My etching work was not very clean, so there were a lot of missed marks, which led to too many divots and bubbles created once I did my Mod Podge and I primed it. So here I am filling it in with a white putty filler. I'm still keeping my etching. It's not as deep as it was before, but I'm trying to get rid of all of these little bubbles that you see and these dark spots which really break the effect of a glowing rune. So I'm going to fill it all in, and it actually works out relatively nicely. I had to do this a few times and then re-airbrush it once it was all done, but I think the final effect came out pretty well. Again, considering this was more of an experiment, something I really don't have a ton of experience doing, it was a little bit of a hassle to go back and redo my work twice, but it was a lesson learned. After this, I went back and I airbrushed it again, following the same tactic and making sure to go extra on the white, giving even more of a glow effect to hide any of the imperfections from my sloppy cleanup job earlier. And I think it did a really good job with that. Here I am taking some Mod Podge on a little sponge brush, and I am just tapping it all around the mud. You can leave some gaps. It's okay to see some of the mud beneath. This is going to be used for the static grass. I'm using two different static grasses, a more burnt brown and a brighter green, and I'm just kind of mixing them in, starting with the brighter green and then covering the top with some of the burnt looking grass to give it some more variety. The stuff does get a little bit messy, but once you tamp it all off, you can always sweep it back into a bag and recover some of your static grass and use it for another project or something else later. Now that that's been done, I'm going to start pulling out a lot of the flowers and grass patches and all the detailing basing supplies that I have. I've collected many of these over time. I feel like the more I have, the better, because I can do more intricate landscapes with different varieties and colors of plant life. So here I'm just putting in some patches of more burnt, bright, standout grass, and I am going to add in some of these stand-up grass pieces that I actually picked up from Green Stuff. They're pretty good. I like them a lot. I mean, you can lay them down. They look like brush, or they look like growth coming up out of the earth. Now I'm going to use a little bit of fine leaf foliage as well. Again, variety is key, so you want to have a good mixture of life. And I really wanted to sell to my players that there's something interesting going on here, where there's just verdant life pouring out from the center of where this plasma sphere is. And when it's all said and done, you have a magnificent looking centerpiece for your next D&D game. This is something that was really easy to build. It's very affordable. The most expensive part was the $15 plasma ball at the center of the piece, but I think this is something that your players are going to find extremely cool, extremely memorable, and it'll allow you to make your next boss fight, encounter, or puzzle room a lot more interesting and bring it to life for your players at the next meetup. I hope you guys found this video interesting and entertaining. This was something, again, that was a bit of an experiment, so I just kind of took a chance by throwing this all together. If you liked it or you have some thoughts, please let me know in the comments down below. Be sure to like and subscribe and share. Of course, that always helps get my videos a little bit more visibility so I can share more of what I'm creating out there. And as always, we'll see you next time. Happy crafting.